3, 4.
First club, which I thought was the best, a lovely room, had a balcony and the acoustics with high ceilings and everything. That was down on West 3rd Street. I think it's now a NYU dormitory. And the people who owned the building just, lease expired and they sold the building. So the club moved uptown to the East 50s. It was the bar of the Sutton Hotel. I don't think it was quite as intimate and warm a club as the first one was. And then in '67, the whole operation closed down. And when I decided to open a club in '75, or the decision was made in '74, Phyllis Condon, Eddie's widow, who was a good friend of mine, she suggested quite nicely, I think, and appropriately, that we use the Eddie Condon name. I think it's been good business to use it, and I think we've used it honestly, because I think the music we play here is in the tradition of what Eddie would have had if he'd been putting bands together today.
Gin and tonic, okay. No, it's a fun place to work. It really is. It gets very busy. Sometimes it gets so busy you don't think you can keep up with the people, and you get 3 or 4 people deep at the bar, and it gets insane sometimes.
It was the first place I looked at, and the guy who ran it, Bill Scala, says, "Well, we're not trying to sell it." And I had the idea when I saw the club. I said, "I think this is the place I'm going to end up at." I looked at a number of other places. In fact, I was about to go into one over on over on 3rd Avenue, East 53rd Street, and came over here late one night after looking at being at Michael's Pub, which is pretty slow. At 1 o'clock was their last set. They were closing down. Coming over to Jimmy Ryan's and seeing a full house at 2:30 in the morning, I said, "Hell, I'm not going to. Never mind the East Side. This is where I want to be." So I called Bill Scala, the guy who had this club, and made him I didn't call. I walked into his office the next day and plunked down a check.
I think I knew Red when he first came around this area, which is quite a number of years ago now. I don't know. I worked, again, as a guest with Red's bands when he was at Your Father's Mustache, and also when he promoted various jazz affairs in the Connecticut area and in New Jersey.
I was playing as a musician in other people's bands, which meant I was thrown up against musicians who I found very hard to play with. So I said, "To hell with this, I'm going to have my own band and pick out my own musicians." Well, I think it was a wise decision. Also, we got into, instead of the hokey banjo type music, we got into jazz. But then after working on my own, booking bands for 7 years, 8 years, I got tired of working at other people's clubs. A lot of times we'd pack the house for them and they'd only sell $400 worth of liquor because you couldn't get served. I mean, I'd sit down with a friend on a drink, on a break, and I couldn't get a drink. I'd go to the bar and pay for it rather than get a freebie at somebody's table. So with that kind of service, you could see how a club like that wouldn't make it, and of course the band was always blamed for it. And while I was never out of work, it was always a question, you knew you were going to get fired from the job sometime or other, and just a question of how long, and you're continually hassling to scrape up new jobs in clubs that did not consider musicians. Pianos would be out of tune. Musicians were treated badly, and finally I decided, hell with it, it's like going from an individual musician to a band leader, and then from a band leader to a club owner. I got tired of relying on other people.
We're going to do a tune guaranteed to win.
top of your heart, of your hard-headed coffers, entitled, "Baby, Won't You Please Come Home." 1, 2, 3.
I consider Eddie Condon's my living room. I spend as much time, if not more, here than I do in my own living room, and I like to think that we're among friends, the musicians and the customers. It's not a It's a place that's run, owned, and by musicians, and it's really for musicians and music lovers. And I think this kind of feeling comes through to the audience.
Baby, won't you please come home? 'Cause your dad is all alone. I have tried in vain, never more to call your name. When you left, you broke my heart, so we promised not to part. Every hour of the day, you can hear me say, baby, won't you please come home? Please, baby, won't you please come home?
Back there. That's Eddie Condon's guitar. He played that. A lot of people ask about it. It's a very old guitar. I guess it's worth quite a bit of money. I'm not a musician. I really don't know that much about music, but you learn a lot by just being around it. And a lot of people want to see it, take it off the wall, can they touch it, and you know, you can't have that. But occasionally, I guess Red will take it down and play it every now and then. There's an Eddie Condon's birthday party that they have every year, and you know, Red plays the guitar, so he'll take it off, and it still works. It's a good instrument.
Of course, we all got into the riverboat jazz, which is really, I think that's where Eddie Condon got his start, was first listening to those boats that used to come up the Mississippi River that had the New Orleans jazz bands on them. He was the first man I know of to create public, what you might be classified as public jam sessions. Then he started along in the company of a fellow by the name of Ernie Anderson. They started doing jazz concerts.
I think Vic Dickinson is probably the only one in our band who actually worked the original Eddie Condon Club, but I think Eddie, if he were to pass judgment on us now, wouldn't be too unhappy.
I met Eddie Condon, I can't correctly date it, but I met him, I would say, in the late 30s. I liked the way he played. You know, he had a good tempo. That's the main thing. The tempo, and the chords being right. He did play good chords and good tempo. He wasn't much of a soloist, but he was a good rhythm man.
Yeah, I was quite friendly with Eddie. Incidentally, on that last job he worked with us, I introduced him what I thought was a hilarious, I said, this is the only man in the history of the city of New York to be thrown bodily out of a club with his name hanging over the marquee. And he said, throw me out, they had to throw me in. He topped me then, as he always did with people.
I have a hard time describing the kind of music that's played here. I have a hard time describing any kind of music. I think it gets very dangerous because everybody has a different definition of the word. Dixieland, swing, Chicago, bebop. What is modern jazz? For instance, that term was coined like in the 40s. So what was modern then? What do you call it? You know, for want of better words, we try to describe it as a Chicago, New York style swing or traditional jazz.
I would say that it's probably an outgrowth of Chicago jazz. What used to be alluded to in 1929 or earlier as dance hall music. Many people think the word Dixieland comes because the initial jazz usually is thought of as starting in New Orleans, which of course is below the Mason-Dixon line. Other people think it comes from the French word for 10, which is D-I-X, In English we'd pronounce it dicks, but I think they say dees, but that may have contributed to it. However, when it got to Chicago, the music was altered slightly by the white musicians, because most of the musicians who came from New Orleans were black musicians. And when the white boys learned from the colored boys and started playing jazz in the Chicago area, it was thought of as Chicago jazz, although really the Dixieland name probably comes from the original Dixieland Jazz Band, a New Orleans band that made the first jazz records of all time. Their first recording was made in 1917. Louis Armstrong was one of the great creative geniuses of all time. And I think it would be very difficult to describe or to categorize anything that Louis played as Dixieland or as mainstream. It was just Louis Armstrong. And beyond any question of doubt, he was the greatest contributor as far as style is concerned that we've ever had.
I discovered, I think, Louis Armstrong is probably the greatest, most influential jazz musician who ever lived.
I think he's influenced every trumpet player that's picked up the horn. Not only trumpet players, but other people, people who play other instruments.
This music went out of vogue for a while. I think the Vietnam War had a lot to do with it, because the kids who had to fight in that war, which was their parents' war, didn't want to fight, and they rejected everything that their parents had liked, including their music, which I think it's a bum rap for us. We didn't. Most of the guys who I know in the music business were against the Vietnam War. But there was that rebellion which put our kind of music into eclipse for a while, and I think it's been a gradual but steady, definite comeback, resurgence.
The spontaneity of the improvisation is what makes the music interesting. Red will call a tune, and we will all improvise on that tune, and it'll be completely spontaneous performances every time we play it. Every time we play it will be different. Sometimes he calls the signals while we're still playing. And of course that's what interests the people, because it's a creative form of music, and you're actually creating, and the public can become a part of that while you're doing it.
I don't consider the voice an instrument. That's just part of entertainment. I like to sing, but I think the tuba is kind of my favorite, except for the kind of music I like. It doesn't fit as well as a string bass. You don't have the same flowing swing, same pulse you have with the string bass.
We have sort of a floating band. There is a nucleus of six players that we consider the regular band, but on any given night, one or more of the fellows might be off. They might be playing elsewhere, and we have quite a few very competent substitutes that we use.
Well, a jazz musician friend of mine, John Windhurst, a trumpet player, this is back in the 40s, before I was ever even played an instrument, said, you ought to get a band in called Balaban and Katz. Of course, this would play on the old Balaban and Katz, K-A-T-Z, the interchange in Chicago. And he thought it was a clever pun to change the K to a C, and you know, the Katz being musicians. And when I finally decided to put a jazz band together, it covered a multitude of sins. I think I worked a two-piece job once, what I called it Balaban and Cat, facetiously, of course.
Well, first and foremost, I'm the regular cornet player. I've been the regular cornet player for the past 5 years, and as long as the club has been open. Second to that, I became manager about 3 years ago, and a year ago I became part owner of Eddie Condon.
The steady personnel has been pretty stable. Ed Polster, the trumpet player, Vic Dickinson, the trombone player, and myself were in the band opening night. Jim Andrews, the piano player, came on the scene two weeks later. Connie Kay came on the end of the year. So only the clarinet, and Herb Hall, who was our original clarinet player, went to Texas, and that's about the only chair, as you could say, has changed since we've been open. However, on any given night, you'd have to see a completely different set of musicians, because it's a 6-night-a-week job, and not many people want to work 5.5 hours, 6 nights a week. Certainly I don't. I work 4 as a rule. So you send in subs. But the kind of subs who do come in are the people who are familiar with this kind of music, the people we've all worked with them before. We have, Eddie Polster and I, who now own the club, have veto power over the subs who come. In other words, we won't accept just any substitute. So the quality, I think, is generally constant, even though the personnel may be different, the faces may be different. People have realized that they've put this kind of music back in its proper historical, artistic perspective, and realized that there's a lot of great guys who are no longer around in the music business. They may as well enjoy those who are.
Police Gazette. We are Ernie Hackett, Dick Dickinson, Ed Bolster, Jack Mayhew, Jim Andrews in the panel. I'm Red Balaban. We're going to have a station coming right back.